Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. We will wait a few seconds and I see that you will be joining us. Today for the first time, and I hope this is the first of many times, I have a very special guest and I'm absolutely happy to connect with Leo. I will not call him Leo because that's Italian name, Leo Zagami, from now United States, but originally from Italy, who is a prolific author, at least 12 books, if not more. I'm not sure if there is more than 12.
There is more because you had Pope Francis the Last Pope, Invisible Masters, and some other collaboration I did, like Vaticano Mason. So, I mean, yes, a few books.
A lot of books Leo has written, and I want to say that he is, in my opinion, one of those people who absolutely have enormous knowledge about Vatican, Jesuits, New World Order, Masonic structures, and it's all connected with the current events as well, and the political systems, and who is who, and who pays who, and who kills who, etc., etc. Leo is very, very informative. And before we start, I want to say that I am very, very grateful to his beautiful wife, Christy, who there is sometimes something good about Instagram, that she really helped me to make this conversation happen. Please make sure to scroll down and check out the website of Leo Zagami. Also, he has a YouTube channel on which he posts very, very regularly with his beautiful wife sometimes too, both in English and Italian. And Leo, could you please show the audience, because the cover of this latest book is just fantastic. This is the latest book. Can you read the title for us and tell us what is this book about?
Okay, first of all, I have to thank for the cover. Of course, I work in collaboration with a real master, an artistic master from Umbria, which is a very particular locality filled with monasteries, immersed in a beautiful context where has some great artists, of course, like Vincenzo Viceversa, who did with me this cover, which has a lot of symbolism, because in all my covers, I want to relay the content of the book in a symbolic way. So here, of course, we have the symbol of the Jesuits, but we have also this eye, which is actually the eye of Lucifer, because it represents the Luciferian court. We have a painting which is represented in the Mother Church of the Jesuits. It's a little bit modified because it adds to the red flag, which is, of course, a bit communistic, also the symbol of communism. And we have substituted this disciple seems to have, in fact, the image of Karl Marx on it, because, of course, the connection between the Jesuits and communism is a very strong one, a connection that so strong that was feared by Pope John Paul II, who was your fellow countryman from Poland. So this book is entitled History, Secret Societies, and the Politics of the Jesuit New World Order and their Luciferian court, which is filled up by Freemasons, Illuminati, think tanks, and all those businessmen, politicians, and religious people who govern the world today, inspired, of course, by Ignazio Loyola, who was the founder of this very influential order, which was established officially in Montmartre in Paris in 1534, and then was approved and sanctioned by the Vatican in 1540, at the heart of the Counter-Reformation, and also just a moment before that turning point in the Catholic history, which was the Council of Trent. So it's with great pleasure that this book, that I always say it's driven by the Holy Spirit, because it came out in a moment, of course, I finished writing this book in the morning after the Pope died, almost the day the Pope died. So it was synchronized very well. It was my intention to expose as a final installment of my work, which is Confessions of an Illuminati, which, like you said, is 12 volumes. But this book in particular can be read also on its own, but is an installment dedicated to the controllers of the controllers, the controllers of the control, the ones who control the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and everything else, like I just said. So it is a book that I wanted to leave at the end of my confession series, when I was more acquainted with my literary skills. I started publishing my confessions in 2009 in Japan. I later on published and became a bestseller also in Italy after becoming a bestseller in Japan. And that led to some problems, because before publishing in Italian, I already had offers from the Vatican, and actually was a collaborator of Marinelli, who was called the General by John Paul II, who approached me and said, if you avoid publishing this book, so we might open a bank account for you and place you as a Grand Master of one of our orders. And I, of course, in turn refused, but ended up, because of my refusal, later on being persecuted. And in the end, I had to flee Italy. I'm no longer Italian since last year. I formally renounced to my Italian citizenship. And I work, of course, here in the United States, protected by the only constitution in the world which guarantees, with the First Amendment, the freedom of speech and the freedom to write whatever I want, something that doesn't happen in any other country in the world, especially in Europe at the moment, which is a dictatorship established by the Jesuits after the Second World War as a compromise between France and Germany that was ushered in then, of course, with the help also of the Bilderberg Club. And there was a Polish guy of great importance in that, which has a whole chapter in my book, which is Joseph Ratzinger. And he was, of course, a very important figure within because he was a Jesuit seminarian. He was an agent of sorts for different people, an advisor even for Winston Churchill, amongst other people. He was, of course, a so-called Polish patriot, but he was also communist. So, and he was, like I said, most of all a Jesuit, because if you attend a Jesuit seminary like him in Rome and then you refuse to become a priest, it doesn't mean that you will not become useful for the Jesuits. And in fact, in this book, I explain how you have, of course, in the Jesuit order, the 4 vows. So you have the Jesuits of the first 3 vows, which are the poverty, obedience, chastity. And then you have, of course, the Jesuit of the 4th vow, absolute obedience to the Pope for their missions. And then you have the 5th class, which is not necessarily even clergy, but even the common folk, that it's useful as almost like a secret agent of sorts, and it can be even non-Catholic at times. But in regards to Poland, that is the place where the Jesuits were denounced for the first time in Monita Segreta by Jerome Zarowski, who was then persecuted. He was a former Jesuit, expelled for disciplinary issues in 1613. And 30 years after the publication of Zarowski's work, then came another controversial book written by a Jesuit that generated even a bigger scandal in the Company of Jesus. That work was entitled Monarchia Soliforum, and it was attributed to a guy called Melchior Inkofer, but it's generally ascribed by scholars to another person, which was Giulio Clemente Scotti. But of course, being of an Italian influential family, they blame somebody else. In any case, Monita Segreta was extremely influential. Some say that the content is not all reliable, but it was very much cherished by people, even by John Paul II himself, that at one point wanted to commission the Jesuit order, even if eventually he will fail. So I kind of describe.
I want to ask you, yes, we will go to Poland. I will have questions about it, but I have some questions I really want to ask you. I really want your answers and hear from you. Few days ago, Trump posted an image of himself that he was dressed up as a pope.
Yes.
In my opinion, he wasn't trolling, he was telegraphing. Right away, my first impression when I saw that image was a message. I took it as a message. Now we, the United States, take over the power of Vatican. This is my interpretation, okay? That also I connected with a post from Trump on April 29, in which he said, "The golden rule of negotiating and success. He who has the gold makes the rules." Thank you. So now we have
I would like to actually...
we have the new dude. Let me ask you my question. We have the new dude, I call him, the Pope Leo 14, the first American Pope. This is a deep state Pope.
No, but let me correct you here a second, because I work also with the Trump administration. I'm a certified press from the White House. So I can tell you that what you're saying is only partially true. The truth was relayed on an article I published on leozagami.com, and it was a warning to the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party, that has been paying for years the Vatican and wanted to have their say within the conclave. It will not technically be correct to say that the United States takes over the Vatican, because it already happened in 1958. So it would be totally wrong to assert that, when the Second Vatican Council was a product already of that compromise, when in 1958 Cardinal Siri, elected regularly, was cast aside in favor of somebody else who was actually a Freemason and a Rosicrucian like Roncalli. So that's why I want to be very clear.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you so much.
No, but also you said something else, of course, in regards to Trump, who has the gold makes the rules. The thing is that, unfortunately, after the Cold War, the United States of America has not poured any gold into the Vatican banks, especially the YOR. Poland was one of the receivers of billions for Solidarność during that time. And of course, it was instrumental for the fall of the whole structure behind the influence, of course, of the Soviet Union, which then collapsed, and then we know what happened later on. But in any case, going back to Trump's warning, Trump was a warning, but the result of it was in reality at the conclave a compromise. The compromise meaning not electing a blatant, obvious Jesuit stooge like, for example, Cardinal Antonio Luis Tagle, from who had the Filipino-Chinese ancestry and who openly supported the China-Vatican deal, which has been signed in 2018, which is also one of the subjects of my latest book, because it involves American intelligence, Theodore McCarrick, the pedophile, the frog cardinal, who also died in early April of this year, and so on. But in regards to, like I said, it was a meme, you were right. It wasn't just a funny thing, like many interpret this, but it wasn't either the thing we take over the Vatican, because this guy is the number one enemy of Donald J. Trump. This guy represents the deep state of Obama, of the Jesuits, of Georgetown, of Fordham. Is not representing at all Trump. He's a critic of Trump since 2015, even before Trump was president, when he was simply running for the primaries. This guy is dangerous because Leo XIV, who, by the way, appropriated a name which was associated with popes who were a little bit more conservative in a way, even if, of course, people say, okay, Pope Leo XIII, open to the workers, this and that, and all the other. Leo XIII, like I also explain in this book, is the guy who promulgated 2 encyclicals against Freemasonry and wasn't at all open to relativism or the vision of the Jesuits, who, by the way, were suppressed for a time, and who were suppressed even in Poland, and they ended up moving a little bit more east under the protection of the Russian Empire to survive until they eventually got back into the fold, but they were always kind of there, even if they were not, because, for example, one of the secretaries, the main secretary of Giovanangelo Braschi, was himself Pope, was himself Abate Marotti, who was a Jesuit, and in the period of the suppression, Pope Braschi tried to help the Jesuits, and also at the end he ordered to release the Jesuit general from Castel Sant'Angelo, where he was in prison, though he died on the way out, apparently. But this is all connected also with the Illuminati, because Abate Marotti happens to be the guy who wrote the rituals of Freemasonry, of the Illuminati, the Masonic part of the ritual.
What we can expect with this new Pope, and is this the last Pope?
You see, the last Pope was definitely Pope Francis. This is not considered a Pope any longer, because he's an Augustinian who is simply going to be used to unify all Christian churches. Why I'm saying that? Because last year, on the 13th of June, like I explained in my latest book, there was a document that was sanctioned by Pope Francis and his Jesuits, and then published on the official, that kind of went unnoticed, if not by the specialist. But this document asserts that the whole thing about papal supremacy, or even the assertion that the Pope had the right to exist, it was all artificially created. Now, it's very interesting, though, that this morning, when, of course, Pope Leo XIV celebrated Mass, and I listened to what he was saying, he mentioned Ignatius of Antioch, because Ignatius of Antioch is the guy they relayed to portray this light that amongst all the communities of Christians, the Bishop of Rome had this role that was given from Peter, this papal role. The papal role, in reality, was always a little bit the fruit of artificial construct. And so when you go on the episcopal lineage, you know, and you see Peter, and then you have a series of names, calculate that the first 150 years is the fruit of artificial construct, not reality. Then it became a reality, but thanks to Ignazio of Antioch, and that's why last year the Jesuits and Pope Francis, because they no longer need to be, you know, the Pope doesn't, is kind of like an impediment to all the Orthodox, Evangelic, Methodist, whatever, coming all together, is that the Pope considers always historically himself to be on top of everybody. And that is an impediment nowadays. And because it's an impediment, they want to remove it with the present Pope, who at that point becomes more and simply a bishop. So now, of course, we are at the initial stages of this papacy, but eventually he will bring out this historical fact, which is an admission which has been made already last year, and can be found on the Vatican website, and you can read, I mean, what they are stating themselves. So at that point, this ticking time bomb means that the last Pope was actually Pope Francis, because this other Pope will be more Bishop of Rome, until he will simply declare himself Bishop of Rome, and equal among equals. At that point, the only impediment to this unification of all Christians is the Orthodox Church of Kirill in Russia, which, of course, is a problem for them, because Kirill doesn't want to do necessarily what Patriarch Bartolomeo II in Constantinople and Istanbul is doing. He is not willing to become also part of the geopolitical strategy of NATO or stuff like that. Of course, we are talking about somebody who comes from a Russian tradition, a Soviet even tradition, as he was at times asserted that he collaborated with the KGB. I've been a guest of the Patriarch in Moscow, been at the interreligious headquarters, which are in this beautiful building, which is behind the big walls that, of course, surround also the Kremlin. And there is, you enter, and there is this beautiful hotel they run there for this interreligious affair. And then at the end of this courtyard, you have this little church, very nice setup. I was guested in a very particular moment for security reasons, mainly because it was the moment of that terrible terrorist attack on the theater, which ended up in a disaster. At the time, I was working for the Russian Ministry of Culture, doing in my capacity as I've been in the media, I've been as a record producer, as long as also being involved for many years in radio, TV, and so on. And so I was actually at the time also given the possibility to play at the Bolshoi, which is quite incredible for a DJ to play at the Bolshoi out of all places. In fact, I was the first DJ in history and probably the only one. But the actual way that the orthodoxy of Russia works is a little bit keeping their own distance. A little bit also the same thing happens with the Coptic Church in Egypt. They are often offered by the Vatican to bow down or to, I remember myself being guested by the Coptic Church and Boutros Ghali's family in Egypt for a month for some research on the Coptic Church in the year 2003, in the fall of 2003. And I remember one day going into I used to stay into this building, which it's owned by the Boutros Ghali family on the river, there on the Nile. And I went, I remember, upstairs to visit them. And suddenly I see all these gifts, so a table full of golden gifts and stuff. And I say, what is this? I mean, it's like, what are you celebrating? He says, well, no, these are the gifts that every year the Vatican tries to give us so we can eventually capitulate to them, but it's never going to happen.
Bribing.
Yes, bribing, if you want to be more, more specific, bribing. So you see, the actual work of the Coptic Church, the way the Pope of the Coptic Church is actually decided, is completely left to the Holy Spirit in a real way. It's not some kind of Vatican election, which they say comes from the Holy Spirit in the 16th Chapel, bestowing itself down to all these old folks who are instead more into politics than into religion. Now, this morning I was watching a press conference made by the American cardinals in Rome, and they were saying, oh, well, we went into with politics, but then we come out with mysticism. Yeah, sure, whatever. I think that the choice of Leo XIV is very clear. He is of the same order of Martin Luther, and so we know what Martin Luther did. That is the beginning of the breaking, and of course you have the creation of the Jesuits, which in the counter-reformations assume a very important role, because in 1560, like I explained in my book, in the 1560s, they also become part of the Vatican intelligence that is established with the name of Holy Alliance, and then later on becomes the entity. So all this, of course, because the Jesuits had given the Pope in 1540 a constitution which was unique. The Augustinians are also similar in the way they have a mission with education. In fact, there's many characteristics, and of course they work hand in hand. But the thing in regards to the Jesuits is that they have this fourth vow, Jesuits, which is basically like saying, I'm 007 with the license to kill. You can do anything. It's not about believing in Jesus or going in foreign lands and bringing Jesus Christ. It's about the interest of the Pope, first of all. So the fourth vow has always been a matter of contention at times between the papacy, the white Pope, and the black Pope. And this happened also with John Paul II when he wanted to commission them with Pedro Arrupe. It happened again with Joseph Ratzinger, who wanted to commission after Hans Covenbach had announced his resignation. There has been conservative popes that have tried to stop this Jesuit order from becoming too powerful after the Second Vatican Council in their Marxist, leftist way of spreading their supposed theology of source, which in reality is bringing us closer and closer to relativism, is bringing us closer and closer to atheism. But in regards to what happens with Pope Francis, that is the ultimate takeover. And once they take over the show, then now there is no turning back. There is no possibility of going back to a conservative Pope. John Paul II was somebody who was brought up in a Marxist, communist country with all the evil of it, understood the evil that communism is. And this is something that I understand myself from my relatives from Russia who escaped before the Russian Revolution and saved their lives through Finland and managed to save their lives. But communism is a real virus in the system, like I always define it in my books. And the roots of communism are to be found not only in those Bolsheviks or that Sabbatean element of the Jews that then gave birth also to labor Zionists, but it is to be found in Jesuitry and Jesuitism, because it was the Jesuits who experimented communism in the Reducciones in South America, and that's why the roots of communism are in South America with the Jesuits, and that's why we have now a guy who, yes, nominally is from the United States, in reality is from Peru. Because he has been very much involved with the church in South America. And in fact, when they asked American bishops about him, they said, we never heard of this guy. We never even know who he is, because he is being always operational in the South America. And we have to also calculate the fact that when he was in charge of some convent in Chicago, he actually covered up for pedophilia, but also later on, he's been accused of covering up pedophilia. That is an accusation that's very heavy. I mean, you have a new pope and you know that this pope is no saint already, that he has a lot of skeletons in the closet. I think we are, of course, in a moment in which there's a lot of disappointment amongst those Catholics who for a moment illuded themselves that we could go back to some form of traditionalism. John Paul II had some characteristics which I disliked because he himself wanted to support certain elements of Vatican II. However, his hate for communism made him more likable, and of course a guy who is still considered a hero by most people in Eastern Europe who come from that tradition, who don't want to go back to that tradition, who lived the fall of the Soviet Union as well as the dismantling of the Iron Curtain and all the countries involved with it. But those people...
But Leo, I will go back to John Paul II. I actually... I was very young when I saw him here in my hometown when he made a tour through Poland. But I will go back to him. I want to ask you, so when I look at this current situation right now, so let me ask you this. This Pope who has been elected, he was still selected by Jesuits and put in this position. If this is the case, how much power Vatican has in the world right now?
Well, I actually have evidence which I'm going to show during my Leo Zagami show on Saturday, which I know you follow, that I conduct with my wife. We're going to be showing evidence of the Jesuits' support and links that he has. And that is going to, of course, become known the moment I show it. So I'm just keeping it a little bit. But in reality, yes, there is, of course, been support, not even a secret support, but rather open support of the Jesuits. And one specific Jesuit in particular of the Fourth Vow, who has supported the whole course of his career, of Leo XIV's career, which culminated, I mean, he was, of course, nominated as cardinal, but cardinals have different orders. So the maximum order is when you become cardinal bishop, which has an apostolic headquarter in or around Rome. And that happened just this year before the Pope went into hospital on the 6th of February. That's when he nominated also to the last stage. You know, like it's like generals. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, and he was at that point made a very special general because he was in preparation of becoming a pope. Let's not forget, though, where he comes from, where this pope has been working when he was a priest, when he was a bishop, when he was a cardinal. We're talking about a Pachamama pope. We're talking about somebody connected to that pagan heresy, which the Francis was quite open about and showed in Rome, and even angered the traditional Catholics, who went to the extent of taking these Pachamama statues from a church and throwing them in the river. And then we had the Italian police having to throw themselves in the river to save the statues of Pachamama. I mean, it was completely ridiculous. I mean, it wasn't the Holy Mary, it wasn't a saint. We're talking here about some pagan thing from South America, which, by the way, is connected also to human sacrifice. So, and in Peru in particular. But in case you want to ask me more about John Paul II, John Paul II is a pope which, of course, people of my age have lived. I mean, I still remember, of course, his predecessor, who lasted only 33 days, Papa Albino Luciani. That was a conclave that still seen the prominent role of Siri, Cardinal Siri, who had always this very conservative force behind him, but then was kind of casted aside in favor of Albino Luciani. Was a visionary in the sense that he wanted to implement certain elements of Vatican II, but he wanted to wage war against the Vatican banking system, and that wasn't really the case at the time. They needed the Vatican Bank to filter money, especially to Holy Solidarność. So in the end, Pope John Paul I was eliminated after 33 days with a poison coffee, and then that led to the election of Pope Wojtyła. Now, Pope Wojtyła wasn't a pedophile, but he liked the ladies. He liked very much the ladies. He liked the nuns, especially if they were Polish. And he was, in that sense, no saint, but he was neither a pedophile. And for me personally, I prefer a pope who likes the ladies, who likes the little kids, the children, because I know that in the 60s, these seminaries became infested with homosexual and pedophiles. This was really the moment in which Vatican II, the turning point for Catholic history, started to change the church. And so they felt, okay, let's, get in all these queers inside. With all the respect for homosexuals, I mean, I have a lot of respect for people who are openly homosexuals, but those who are closed and who are also priests, for me, are the worst of the worst. And so I have a lot of problems with that. And nowadays we have 80% of the clergy which is homosexual, and that is a product of those pink palaces, like I call them in my book. Pink palaces. Yes.
I'm sure you know this, or you've heard of it, I'm sure. We had a lot of stories coming about John Paul II, because he truly was like a Polish hero for Polish people, okay? But many stories were coming out that he actually had a family, he had a son, never been married, but he was in a relationship and he has a son.
Yes.
Now, I was thinking for some time, because I question everything, and I was wondering, was he selected by CIA to be in that position as a pope?
He had been.
And I want to know, you remember the accident when they tried to, Ali Akça, when they tried to kill him, right? Who really wanted to kill him, Leo? What was the reason?
Okay, that is a few questions you made. So, I mean, I have to answer one at a time. Pope Wojtyła, John Paul II, came from, of course, a time in which Poland was definitely a strategic asset. We saw what happened during the Second World War. The Second World War started because of Poland, at least officially. and so Poland has always been a strategic asset. And even to this day, what is happening in Ukraine is connected to Poland, because the Order of St. Stanislaw unifies Poland and Ukraine under the banner of fighting the Orthodox Russians under the Catholic Church, and with the blessings of Freemasonry. So John Paul II was somebody who had worked behind the scenes already for the intelligence. He had had an experience, and of course, at that point, he was called to take on a role which he did take. Now, when it comes to, he had a family, he had this, he had that. Well, I mean, yes, but probably was less tragic than what happened with Pope Francis, who had a son called Tomasito, who died and was buried in the Vatican at 11, who seems a little bit more tragic, the whole thing. But in regards to this fact, the problem is you are stopping somebody from his natural course when you are asking him celibacy. And that's why, as you know, in the Orthodox churches, there's various levels in which you want to take celibacy, of course, you bring it to the next level. That means that at that point, you are no longer engaging with the women simply because it's an energetic thing, but it's also a spiritual thing. And so that is completely, it has all my respect. However, forcing the whole of priesthood into celibacy, that's a different thing, because then you end up inspiring what happened in the 60s with the entrance of those homosexuals that necessarily, they end up doing things that are against nature. So here it's about a church that has been about compromises. From the very start, the idea in the Catholic Church of bringing around the celibacy was more connected with the interest of the inheritance of people and their families. And so giving everything to the church rather than giving it to your son or your daughter or whatever. So I think that at the end, John Paul II, in a way, did what he had to do, ended up in his role as Pope. Of course, he was a Pope that then was within a geopolitical context that had to be brought into more tension. And so the people who actually attempted his life were not necessarily the ones that we are blaming officially. Blaming officially the Soviet Union through Bulgaria and all that history with Ali Shah, it's of course part of the charade, the theater, that then ended up even with a supposed miracle because he wasn't killed. And so then you bring in the Lady of Fatima and the whole show. But in reality, Ali Shah was working for the Vatican Freemasons, and the weapon was handed to him by the guy who initiated me in 1993, Prince Aliata di Montereale. And I wrote this in my confessions. So the actual moment in which we see the attempt to the life of the Pope, of course, everything is blamed instrumentally on the Soviet Union through Bulgaria, because that's where they said that Ali Shah had connections and all that. I mean, when you are taking a professional hitman from Turkey, because that's what Ali Shah was, and you use him for this, well, Ali Shah then, from that moment onwards, he has been claiming everything and the contrary of everything. But the evidence that came into my, as I was initiated in 1993, it wasn't so long after the event. So I could still have some testimonies, and the testimony that was apparently given to me, and I tend to believe it because it was given amongst Masons, as I was a Mason at that point. I was initiated in April 1993. And that was that the pistol of Ali Shah was given within a lodge, which was in Sicily, in Trapani, in a lodge in Trapani, and was given to Ali Shah. And then, of course, there was a couple of cardinals also who were involved. Ali Shah tends to say things, and of course, he also wants to blame the involvement of Iran, which, of course, Iran could also be used in this whole thing. And there is a reason why Iran could be using this whole thing and why Iran wanted the death of John Paul II. The Shah, when he left Iran, he picked up all, and this is something I reveal in volume 10 of my Confessions, all the gold of Iran was brought out by Sicilian mobsters to the Vatican Bank. So, you know, Ayatollah Khomeini went in front of the cameras and said, oh, the Shah just left, like, you know, he left and he didn't bring away anything. He's just, you know, a bad guy and we have defeated him and all that. But in reality, he had prepared in the January of the year when he left, he had prepared everything and he made sure that all this gold was brought to the Vatican Bank. Now, the Vatican Bank, in that period of great tension, had also problems. Lost a lot of money to things that they shouldn't have done or been involved with. There was the collapse of a bank and many other things happened because it was all in connection with the Italian mob, with Cosa Nostra, essentially, which was still the main Italian mafia at the time. It's no longer the case. Now the main Italian mafia is the Calabrese mafia, the 'Ndrangheta. But both of them are controlled by Freemasons. Freemasons control the mafia. The mafia that you see in the movies, that is the low ranks mafia. The real mafia is the supreme councils of the Scottish Rite, of these maybe at times illegitimate or irregular so-called Masonic bodies, at times regular. Because, I mean, when it came to Prince Aliade, he was a prince, he was a family friend of mine, because I'm from Sicily, I'm a baron in Sicily, a marquis, an aristocrat, and within the aristocracy of the Sacred Roman Empire, we were given the possibility of becoming immediately 33rd degree, and of course, sovereign grand commanders. And so that, of course, it's all to do with the Masonic tradition and Masonic history, which, of course, we can't dwell in today because it would take hours. But
it's absolutely fascinating, and I would love to learn from you about this. But here is my question. I remember a documentary. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. A while back, I don't remember the date. The Vatican was quite in a financial trouble, and they collaborated with Rothschilds and Rockefellers, I think. Something with money, some deals with money, but also another question here within this.
Well, of course, Rothschilds have always been great bankers connected to the Vatican. They're not formally now, but they were in the past, and they actually were involved also with financing the hit, for example, of Roberto Calvi, who ended up killed under the Blackfriars Bridge in London because of, I mean, there were many people who were killed because of this money issue with between the mob and the Vatican Bank, and then Sindona himself was kidnapped. And I mean, a lot of things happened, and John Paul II was no saint, of course. He was involved with Marcinkus. Marcinkus was himself a member of the P2 of Freemasonry, of the Monte Carlo Lodge of the P2, which I eventually ended up joining myself. You see, I was involved directly with all these people until 2006, when I ended up after coming out, and that was the moment also in which I started fighting these people, and they counteracted the whole thing by getting me accused of espionage in Norway, and that led to a lot of problems for me. And so the story, of course, is related in my books. People who have read my books know very well my story, but I started then exposing such things with documents and evidence in 2006. And then, of course, I immediately noticed that the internet was very much prone to censorship. So then I remember when I got with my wife, which became my wife, but I was married before. My first wife betrayed me. She preferred to join the enemy for her money and interest, because her family was very much connected with these people. And so then I found Christy, who instead brought me to Japan. And that's when we ended up signing my first book deal for the Confessions of an Illuminati, which were only published in the English language several years later in 2015. And from that moment onwards, of course, they led to collaborations with various people, amongst other people, Alex Jones, of course, and InfoWars, which I've been collaborating with as a Vaticanist for many years. He came to Rome, and we were able also to create an organization in Rome, Italians for Trump, Trampiani d'Italia, the first organization, even before he won the primaries, who supported, and then all along the presidency of Donald J. Trump, when he became president and took his oath, we made these incredible events in front of the American embassy. We rented a beautiful building in front of the Italian parliament. We had all the VIPs of Italy, and it was an event that, of course, Steve Bannon and other people talked about because it was unique outside of America, and we gave the full support of the Italian-American community. Many of these people, of course, were also Freemasons and stuff, but there was also Freemasons who were on the side of the good that wanted to support Trump. And this was an attempt we made during the first presidency of Trump. It didn't really work out, though, for me, because they were so powerful, the enemies of Trump, that in the end I had to flee Italy in May 2019, and I have not been back since, because still to this day the police goes and interrogates my mother, stuff that I mean Italy is as communist as the Soviet Union is at the moment. Europe is a hellhole. And I explain why in this book. I explain how the Jesuits created Europe. From the very first meetings with the Freemasons they did at the time of the Nazis, they were, working at the same time with the Nazis on one side, with a Polish black pope, because the head of the Jesuits was Polish at the time, and of course with the Freemasons in case the Nazis would be defeated. Let's not forget, like I state in my book, that when the Russians went into Russia, the Germans went into Russia, the Nazis, the SS, brought along with them the Jesuits in order to convert the Orthodox. And that is a modality which is still in use, because these days we see the symbol of the armed forces of Ukraine. That is the symbol of the Order of San Stanislao. That is the symbol that unifies Polish and Ukrainians under the British intelligence and Freemasonry against Russia. But people, of course, don't know this. They tend to think it's all conspiracy theory. But in reality, there was an attempt before everything changed with the coup d'etat in 2014. There was an attempt to ban these Masonic orders. And I personally, when I was still within the fold, I remember going to dinner with the Grand Master of the Order of St. Stanislaw in London one day, because at the time it was a British Freemason who I actually happened to know. And he was involved, of course, with MI6, CIS. So people, of course, tend to...
In charge, Leo? Who is really in charge when we look at this whole structure? Is Russia completely out of this system? Is Russia outside of it, and there is no influence in Russia as far as Jesuits go, or there is still some?
Let's not forget, though, that when the suppression of the Jesuits was, when the Jesuits, there was a moment in which they got kicked out of the Vatican and they went to Russia for help. So there was like a legacy there, a long time. Let's say that things changed because, of course, once the Jesuits went back into the Vatican after the death of Napoleon, things changed. And eventually Russia understood that the Jesuits were dangerous and banned them also at that point. So things change, things change because Russia went from one ruler to the other, and of course things change when you change the rulers. Eventually Russia became, of course, the subject of a takeover by certain forces of progressive Freemasonry, guided by the Grand Lodge de France, the Grand Orient of France, who supported Lenin and Trotsky in their initial stages. The Tsar had in 1905, at that point, taken away that law that kind of prohibited for new lodges and new Masonic institutions, and they took advantage of it by the founding of the Grand Orient of all people, that became of great help for the Bolsheviks. In reality, Freemasonry was always present, but different branches of Freemasonry were at war at the time. They are no longer at war now, so the situation is very different from what it used to be. Nowadays, Russia has a branch of Freemasonry, which I know very well. I interviewed, you can find online, an interview with the Deputy Grand Master, Smirnov, who I did many years ago during a conference in Rome with all the representatives of the Grand Lodge of Russia, which I know, and great people, absolutely. But they, in fact, they are totally different in the sense that their loyalty goes, first of all, to the president, Vladimir Putin, and then later on to Freemason. I remember one evening, me and my wife were there for dinner with all these Russians, and there was some kind of emergency, and they had to leave, some of them, and go to the Russian embassy in Rome during the international gathering of the Memphis and Mizraim, which is a rite of Freemasonry that a friend of mine had established in some way in Russia from Italy, Giancarlo Seri. So I think that in regards to Freemasonry at the moment, Russia has a state Freemasonry of sorts, but like I explained in volume 9, there is also been an attempt, once again by the French, to establish a renegade faction of Freemasons in Russia. But I don't think it's working out. I don't think that Russia will permit today anything to happen that goes out of control. So you have a Grandmaster who is very much, like I said, connected to Putin and who lets him do his things. He maintains, of course, the legitimacy of Freemasonry within the Anderson Constitution. He still has a recognition by London. Of course, when this war happens with Ukraine, then there were attacks from, the Ukrainian Freemasons accusing the Russians of being no longer in line with the regularity, and all this happened. But I must say, and this is quite interesting, that London didn't take sides. So they kind of like stepped back and said, okay, we don't want to take the Ukrainian side. It would have become too evident at that point, you understand, that they were, that because London has other orders and other ways of influencing the Ukrainian Masons, but in any case, they don't want to make themselves too visible in that sense. You have Odessa, who in fact has never been taken by the Russians, which is in fact the Masonic center of Ukraine to this day. And that's where the Grand Master of Ukraine is today. In regards to the Jesuits, the present Father, General Arturo Sosa, is a communist from Venezuela, a leftist, who of course was liked by Pope Francis, who placed him there as a Jesuit general. But like I said, when it comes to ultimate control of Freemasonry, of all these think tanks, you have to go to the Jesuits, because they are the ones who really control everything. And that's why in my book I talk about Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger, which was a quadruple agent. He was, of course, Polish, but he was a very important figure in the so-called European integration and what the Jesuits did after the Second World War, which I describe very well in this book. I explain how the Jesuits helped every step of the way the creation of the European Union from the European community, all the people involved. This is an historic book. I mean, this book is a bestseller and it's not being debunked by anybody because this is an academic work. It's not some guy who makes up stories, because I'm challenging the Jesuits, and the Jesuits are the scholars of the church. They are not only the intelligence operatives and at times the assassins, but they are the scholars. So when you're challenging a professor, you need to know your shit, as they say here in America, because otherwise you will be debunked in a second. And that's why, like I attempted to say at the beginning, but maybe I didn't clarify, I left this as the last installment because I really wanted to be ready for it. It was like, you know, preparing like Rocky Balboa does for his fight. And then when you really feel you are good enough, you can wage war against your enemy. So,
but the timing, Leo, even your life's journey, right? Look at this, the whole preparation for this very book and the timing of it to come out. There is no coincidence. This is like divine timing. Yeah. Really, it is divine timing.
Absolutely. And because, you know, you felt, you feel guided by the Holy Spirit if you're doing something like this. And all along, I hoped that Pope Francis would be able to read this book, because I wanted him to actually read this book and die. I know that that seems a little bit maybe too harsh, but I just wanted to, you know, read this book and say, okay, amen. And then, yeah. But unfortunately, he died on the day I was still finishing the book. It didn't work out. But it worked out in the sense that this book, of course, then is projected with the whole thing is contemporary, because when you see here, the book talks in past tense of Pope Francis. I had to rework the whole thing within the next 24 hours after his death. But then it worked out very well, actually. And going back to Joseph Ratzinger, because he's a Polish wartime figure that many people don't know about, and that definitely doesn't appear in the history books. He doesn't even appear in the books that talk about the Bilderberg Club. A colleague of mine, which I, you know, like Daniel Estolin, doesn't even mention Ratzinger within his book. And I find it very suspicious, to tell you the truth, because at the end, Joseph Ratzinger was, and just to describe you who he was, a Lord of Freemasonry, as I call him in my book, a Catholic Jew, a Jesuit agent, a clandestine communist, a persevering Polish patriot who actually would have liked probably Poland to be falling on the other side rather than under the Iron Curtain at the end. So he got a little bit disappointed. And at that point, he dedicated himself to European integration, and he founded the Bilderberg Club. And he became the collaborator and advisor of Mexican President Plutarco Allais-Calles. He became the collaborator of two Polish wartime prime ministers, Sikorski and another one called Miloaszewski. I have impossible pronunciation in Polish, which I can't seem to get. Ratzinger was trusted also by the British intelligence. And in fact, in my book, I also show a picture of him with the British intelligence. And he could call at any time of night and day Winston Churchill, who is fellow Freemason. So, I mean, it wasn't like any kind of figure, this guy. Ratzinger had been somebody very important for the Jesuits. After he refused to become a priest, he was then entrusted with another mission, and he was born in Krakow, who at the time, as you know, was part of the Austro-Hungaric Empire. He was the youngest of 4 children. His father, Joseph Stanislaw Ratzinger, was the personal legal counsel of the Count Władysław Zamoyski. And this is also very important. Poland has an aristocracy. It's not any kind of country. It has a serious aristocracy. And so I relate very much to this aristocracy because, of course, I'm an aristocrat. I know the history of the noble and the aristocrat families and the royal families of Europe. And so I have much respect for that part. You see, in 1992, when the whole Iron Curtain was falling into pieces and Soviet Union also, there was a proposal by my grandmaster at the time, Prince Aliado di Montereale, to bring back aristocracy and royalty in Eastern Europe. It didn't work out because otherwise we will have now the Kingdom of Romania, the Kingdom of we will have different kingdoms that don't. The choice was made to go the other way, the Republic way, and so it went that way. I'm not saying it's a better or a worse way, but it went the other way. Though I have to admit one thing, and this out of honesty. There is only one republic in the world that can be called as such. The rest is just fictional republics built out of illusion, and that is the whole of Europe included, because the only republic with a constitution that defends the people is the American Constitution. There is no such things like First Amendment or Second Amendment in Poland. Do you ever wonder why? Or in Italy? Because these are communist countries, including Italy. That after the Second World War, Italy actually was a fascist country that was taken from a monarchy into a republic by a fraudulent poll. The idea of the alliance of NATO was that we can't give weapons to these people. They're too dangerous. They could become dangerous tomorrow like they were in the past. And either they were communist. Well, of course, Poland was not even under that because they were under Russia. But Russia, of course, will not give them any weapons. Communist countries, the first thing they do is take your weapons. That happened with Mao Zedong. It happened with the Soviet Union. It happened with anybody. And that gives you the idea of why you have rulers who are technocrats, even if they pretend to be elected. Poland is a shithole at the moment. Sorry if I say that. I have to admit that. But it's just as bad as Romania.
Sorry. In this particular case, don't be sorry. It's exactly...
You agree. You agree. But just like Romania, I mean, went a little bit out of the thing. They said, the elections are not valid. So there is no democracy at the moment in Europe. Either you are accepting their own technocratic ideology, which is fruit of this Jesuit establishment that rules Europe, or otherwise you are out, and you are immediately out, meaning that you are either arrested, persecuted. They do what they did to Marine Le Pen. They did what they did to Georgescu. There is no freedom in Europe. And that's why I'm here and not in Europe. So for me, it's a personal matter. I have been, unfortunately, persecuted for what I'm doing. And so for me, when I say there is only one republic, one constitution, one freedom, is America. But in practice, not in theory. Because here they tried maybe in the past to say, we survived 4 years of Joe Biden. It was like being under a dictatorship. At least we started to see really what the future will be if we had Kamala.
Feel it. Absolutely. You could feel it. Yes.
Yes. You were there. You said you were there in 2020 when they fraudulently took the election. And then it became like censorship, algorithms that block anything you say. It was
open borders,
let anybody in. And those people that came in because of the Catholic NGOs and the Jesuits in South and Central America who wanted to change the landscape of America also electorally. Because if you have a bunch of brainwashed South American, Central Americans who are, of course, controlled by the Jesuit mindset and the Catholic mindset, and with a Catholic president like Joe Biden, it was just hell. So we saw what happens, but we also saw the antidote that America has. Because if in any case these people will have attempted to do the same thing they did in 2020, in 2024, when I had the privilege to elect Donald J. Trump, well, at that point, we have still the Second Amendment, we still have our weapons, and we still would have gone to a civil war. So, I mean, this is resistance. You don't have the resistance in Europe. I mean, for me, being in Italy, it was like being castrated. I'm half British, I'm not only Italian. So for me, being in Italy amongst those people who are enslaved since the Second World War, whose only weapons are in the hands of Cosa Nostra, the mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, the Camorra, I mean, and then, of course, the police, I mean, that was nightmare. So the Vatican controls the mafia, controls everything. In Europe, thanks to Brussels, they have Jesuit headquarters specifically addressing the European Union. They have control over the chapel, where they have this unified kind of Christian chapel with all the various denominations and meet up there. I mean, these people actually, in my book, I describe how that there was and name by name. It's not just simply saying, oh, this Jesuit, the Jesuits did this. No. Name, surname, what they did during the Second World War, what they did after the Second World War to help the European integration, and what they're doing now when they have created groups like the Eco-Jesuits fighting climate change. This Pope here is a Jesuit stooge from the Augustinian order, which is an order that works hand in hand with the Jesuits. He comes from Peru, which is notoriously in the hands of the Jesuits, like the rest of Central and South America. I mean, I come from...
But Leo, are you surprised? Because I remember I've heard you on many interviews, and I know you have to go.
I was very surprised it wasn't either...
Yes, you were saying that the Chinese Filipino was your probably number one, and then was the one from Africa, right?
Yes.
So are you?
I tell you what happened during the conclave, if you want, briefly, because we don't have much time, because I have to go for another interview soon. What happened was this: during the conclave, the first day, Tagle got 18 votes. The Africans also started to gather votes. It seemed like in the end, there was also the Italians who still wanted Parolin. And it became all a little bit of problematic. So in the end, they brought up this guy who was already a choice of the Jesuits, as much as Tagle, but it seemed to have more, it was like not so divisive, because unfortunately, they had to find a way of fighting Donald J. Trump. However, if they, in Africa, they had found candidates who were, at the end, all considered too conservative. So they didn't manage to usher in that black pope they wanted, though probably they will the next time. Or the Cardinal Antonio Luis Tagle, who is a Filipino with Chinese ancestry, who is openly in support of the Vatican-China deal. It is like they didn't manage to do that because the Americans intervened, and there was also, you see, when you said at the beginning of the show, the American deep state intervened and now takes control of the Vatican. The Americans had control of the Vatican since the Second World War. They freed America, they freed Italy, they freed the rest of Europe, they took charge of Europe, as well as the Vatican State. They established Freemasonry with the English. There was a charter given for 4 lodges under the Duke of Kent. And that is something that has changed then with the Second Vatican Council, and then the progressive input of the Grand Lodge de France, which was another great Masonic player in this whole thing. And so the Jesuits then, like I explained, volume 12, sealed this alliance with the Freemasons more and more, but not any Freemasons, because the Freemasons like the P2 were considered too conservative. And Bergoglio, for example, who was initiated into the P2 in Argentina, at one point was seen as a threat. He only managed to regather the position in the Jesuits when he refused to become the commissioner appointed by Ratzinger. Ratzinger wanted to appoint Bergoglio as commissioner to the Jesuits, doing the same thing a few years before John Paul II had attempted. When Padre Rupe mysteriously collapsed and had some health issues, which I start to think were induced there by a CA who saw that at the time the Jesuits were not going along with the war against the Soviet Union because they had too much of a Marxist element. Now, in my latest book, I bring also the testimony of a 4th vow Hungarian Jesuit who was also a Freemason, and you can read all about it because he's established a lodge during the Cold War in Hungary, and his testimony is very important because I think he actually talks about how he lived being a Freemason as well as a Jesuit. But remember, you are first and always, like Bergoglio in the end demonstrated by renouncing to become a commissioner, you are first of all a Jesuit and then eventually a Freemason. So I have to thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. I would have much more questions, but I know you have to go and you gave me much more time than we actually intended.
Thank you
The
so
book
much.
is
I see that
available.
your audience enjoyed it, and that's a pleasure.
Yes.
And of course,
Thank
we can do part 2 maybe in the coming weeks, so we can continue this discussion with more questions, also maybe addressed from your audience. The banking connection is very important, but we will have to address it the next time in detail. So God bless you all, and take care, guys.
Thank you so
See you
much.
soon.
Grazie mille, Leo. Thank you so much.
Grazie, Ania,
The
and we
links
see
are down
each
below.
other soon for another episode.
Bye. Arrivederci.